They were told to close their eyes. They were told that the American GIs were monsters, that captivity meant horrors whispered in the humid jungle air but never spoken aloud. They were animals, driven by base instincts, men who had crossed an ocean to burn their world to gray ash. But when 32 Vietnamese women, field nurses, radio operators, and supply clerks were captured by the 101st Airborne after the fall of their jungle outpost near Hue, the enemy broke them, not with violence, but with something far more unexpected. They expected degradation. They received sterile field dressings and iodine. They braced for starvation. They smelled the impossible, intoxicating aroma of hot coffee and frying meat from a field kitchen. One woman, Lynn, a 21-year-old radio operator from a village that no longer existed, whispered to the girl beside her as they sat, hands bound in the belly of a rattling C-130 transport plane. Her voice shook. She had spent 3 weeks retreating, hiding in tunnels, expecting the worst, rehearsing the stories of their glorious martyrs, preparing for an end she could not imagine. But what waited beyond those gates was not an end at all. It was the beginning of something that would shatter everything she thought she knew, about the enemy, about her cause, and about herself. Before we continue with this incredible, forgotten story, if you appreciate these deep dives into the untold history of war, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us bring them to light. The Tet Offensive had ended months earlier, in 1968. While the world reeled from the shock, a different kind of reckoning began for thousands of women who had served the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They wore black pajamas, yes, but they had typed reports, operated switchboards, bandaged wounds, and calculated mortar trajectories. They were the invisible infrastructure of a jungle war machine that had finally been exposed. Lynn had been stationed at a communications post hidden beneath the canopy of banyan trees when the Americans arrived. The attack was not a wave of men, it was a wave of noise, artillery, then the thwack-thwack-thwack of helicopters that drowned the world. The officers fled into the tunnel system, the men scattered to fight and die. But the women, they had nowhere to go. Their homes were rubble, their families were scattered or dead. When the American soldiers found them, Lynn still clutching her headset, 2 young nurses huddled beside a crate of dwindling medical supplies, no one knew quite what to do with them. For days, they were held in a temporary camp, sleeping on damp ground. Then came the announcement. They were being transferred, not as they feared, to the ARVN, the ARVN, the South Vietnamese army whose prisons were spoken of with a special kind of dread. They were being transferred to the Americans, to the massive, sprawling U.S. base at Da Nang. The news spread like wildfire. Da Nang, the word itself, felt dangerous. They had been told stories about the Americans for years, brutal stories, stories of helicopters pushing people into the sea, stories of villages wiped out for sport. Now those stories would become their reality. The journey began on a gray morning. The women, still in their worn black pajamas, were loaded onto trucks. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the damp, rotting smell of the jungle. Lynn clutched her small canvas bag, everything she owned in the world, a change of underwear, a water purification tablet, and a small faded photograph of her mother and younger brother. As she climbed onto the truck, her legs felt weak. The metal was hot under her hands. Behind her, a girl no older than 17 sobbed quietly. The journey to the airfield was a blur of fear. The helicopter ride was a torment. The machine roared and pitched, and most of the women were sick. They huddled in the cargo hold, the air thick with sweat and vomit and fear. The American guards on the helicopter were not cruel. That was the first surprise. They were not warm either. They were professional, distant, chewing gum, seemingly bored. They maintained order, but they did not taunt or threaten. This confused the women more than hostility would have. They had prepared themselves for monsters. About an hour into the flight, Lynn was shivering, not from cold, but from shock. An American soldier, young, maybe 20, sat near the open door, smoking a cigarette. He glanced at her, then at the girl sobbing next to her. He looked away. After a moment, he reached into his pack, pulled out a small green wool blanket, and tossed it on the floor in their direction. Lynn stared at it. This was a trick. It had to be. But the soldier just went back to smoking, looking out at the green canopy below. Finally, Lynn's companion slowly reached out and pulled the blanket over them. It was rough, but it was warm. The soldier said nothing. When the 15 minutes were up and they were herded off the helicopter, Lynn was more confused than ever. Finally, they landed. The base at Da Nang was not a camp, it was a city. As the trucks drove them from the airstrip, Lynn stared. The buildings were intact, tall, clean. Not a single bombed-out shell, not one collapsed roof. The contrast was staggering. There were roads, streetlights, men playing basketball. The sheer scale of it, the abundance, the normalcy, was more terrifying than the jungle. Everything looked untouched by war. Finally, the trucks turned onto a dirt road. In the distance, Lynn could see buildings surrounded by high fences. Guard towers stood at intervals. Her heart began to race. This was it. The camp. The place they would be held. The place where, she had been told, her suffering would truly begin. The trucks passed through the main gate, which stood open, and pulled to a stop in a large dirt courtyard. The women were ordered to climb down. Lynn's legs were stiff. She stood with the others, blinking in the late afternoon sun, looking around at what would be her prison. But the camp was larger than she had expected. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in neat lines. The buildings looked recently painted. The paths between them were swept clean. American soldiers walked around casually, some smoking, some talking in groups. It looked almost like a military base, not a prison camp. But the fences were real, the wire was real, and they were inside it. An American officer, a woman in uniform, stepped forward. This was the first shock. A woman. She addressed them in heavily accented but understandable Vietnamese. They would be processed. They would be deloused. They would be assigned quarters. The tone was matter-of-fact, neither kind nor cruel, just procedural. The women were divided into groups and led toward a long, low building. This is where it happens, Lynn thought. This is where the humiliation begins. She had heard stories, terrible stories, stories whispered in the tunnels about what happened to captured women, stories that made her want to vomit. The door to the building opened, and steam billowed out. Inside, it was warm and bright. Tiled walls reflected electric light. American women in white uniforms stood waiting, medical staff. Lynn's group was directed to stand in a line. One by one, they were called forward. A medic, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, checked each woman briefly, looked at eyes, throat, hands. No one was rough, no one made crude comments. It was clinical, efficient, almost gentle. When it was Lynn's turn, the medic looked at her calloused hands and the infected cut on her arm, cleaned it with iodine and put on a sterile bandage. She said something in English, then found the word in Vietnamese. "Better," she said. "You will feel better soon." After the medical check, they were directed to another room. This was the delousing station. Lynn's heart pounded. She remembered propaganda images, degrading images, designed to show how enemies treated their prisoners. But what she saw made her stop in confusion. There were shower stalls, real shower stalls with curtains for privacy. And on a table near the entrance, stacked neatly, were bars of soap. Actual soap. White, clean, heavy bars that smelled of something Lynn could not quite identify. Something floral. Something that reminded her of her mother's house before the war. Each woman was handed a bar of soap, a towel, and a clean cotton gown. They were told to shower, to wash thoroughly, and to put on the gown afterward. Their old clothes would be burned. For a moment no one moved. This could still be a trick, but what kind of trick, and to what end? Finally, one woman, an older nurse from their unit, stepped forward and took a shower stall. The others followed. Lynn found herself in a small tiled space, alone for the first time in weeks. She turned on the water and nearly gasped. It was hot. Actually hot. Not lukewarm, not cold from a jungle stream. Hot water streaming from the showerhead, creating clouds of steam. She stood under the water for a long moment, just feeling it on her skin. Then she picked up the soap. It lathered immediately, rich and thick. She washed her hair, her face, her body, scrubbing away weeks of grime and fear and confusion. The water at her feet ran gray, then clear. Around her she could hear others crying. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears mixing with the shower water. The relief was overwhelming. The simple act of being clean, truly clean, after so long was almost painful. It reminded them of being human, of a time before war, before loss, before this nightmare that had swallowed their entire world. When Lynn emerged from the shower, wrapped in the rough but clean towel, she felt lighter. Not happy, not safe, but lighter. She dried herself and put on the cotton gown. It was simple, plain, but clean. It smelled like laundry soap and sunshine. The women gathered again in the outer room, all in identical white gowns, hair wet and dripping. They looked at each other differently now. Cleaner. Smaller somehow without their black pajamas. More vulnerable. More themselves. From the processing building, they were marched across the compound to a large wooden structure. The sun had set, and the air was cooling. Even before they reached it, Lynn could smell something that made her head swim. Food. Real food. Cooking food. The smell was so strong, so overwhelming, that several women stopped walking, just stood there, breathing it in. Inside, long tables stretched the length of the room. At one end was a serving counter. American soldiers were already eating at some tables. But a large section was empty, waiting. The women were directed to form a line. Lynn picked up a metal tray and moved down the line. Behind the counter, American cooks in white aprons ladled food onto her tray. Not the watery rice gruel they had lived on for months. Not the single shared sweet potato. It was potatoes, actual boiled potatoes, yellow and steaming, green beans, and then, incredibly, a thick slice of meatloaf with dark gravy, a piece of white bread with a pat of butter, and a cup of coffee, real coffee, dark and hot. She stared at the tray. The amount of food was more than she had seen in months, more than she had eaten in a single week. For the past year, meals had been watery soup, black bread that tasted like sawdust, sometimes a thin slice of manioc. This was abundance beyond imagination. Lynn sat at one of the long tables with other women. For a moment, no one ate. They just looked at the food. The steam rose from the plates. The smell was intoxicating. Then, slowly, one woman picked up her fork. Then another. Then Lynn. The first bite of meatloaf made her close her eyes. It was warm. It was seasoned. It tasted like food was supposed to taste. She chewed slowly, afraid that if she ate too fast, she would be sick. Around her, women ate in silence, some with tears streaming down their faces. The girl who had cried on the helicopter sat across from Lynn, fork halfway to her mouth, just staring at the food as though it might disappear. The bread was soft inside. The butter melted into it. Lynn had not tasted butter in 2 years. She bit into the bread and had to steady herself. It was too much, too good, too impossible. She thought of her younger brother, Hai, who had starved to death in the last famine.
He had been 9 years old. They had buried him in the rubble of their village because the cemeteries were gone. Hai had asked for bread before he died, just bread, and there had been none. Now Lin sat in an enemy prison camp, eating butter on white bread while her brother's bones lay in Vietnamese ruins.
The contradiction was unbearable. The guilt was crushing. She forced herself to keep eating. Her body needed it, but every bite tasted like betrayal. The woman next to her, a signals operator from Quang Tri, whispered, "My mother is starving. My mother would kill for this potato. How can this be?" No one had an answer. They ate in silence, mechanically, feeling the food fill their empty stomachs, feeling strength return to their bodies, and feeling the terrible weight of survival when so many they loved had not survived. After the meal, they were assigned to barracks. Each building housed about 40 women in double-stacked bunks. The barracks were simple but clean. Wood floors swept smooth, windows with actual glass, and each bunk had a mattress, not a board, a real mattress with sheets and 2 blankets. Lin was assigned to Barrack 7, Bunk 23, lower. She set her small bag on the mattress and just stood there. The last time she had slept in a real bed was over a year ago. Since then, it had been tunnel floors, hammocks, damp earth. This mattress gave slightly under her hand. The sheets were rough cotton but clean. The blankets were wool, thick and warm. The woman assigned to the bunk above her was the older nurse, Tom, who had stood so rigid on the ship. She looked at Lin and said quietly, "I do not understand what is happening." Lin nodded. "I do not either." That night, the first night in the camp, Lin lay in her bunk wrapped in the wool blankets. The barrack was dark except for a single light bulb at each end. Outside, she could hear American soldiers talking, their voices low and relaxed. Crickets sang in the warm night air. The air smelled of salt from the nearby sea. She closed her eyes and tried to understand. This was supposed to be hell. This was supposed to be the punishment for fighting the invaders. But she was clean. She was fed. She was warm. She was, against all expectations, still alive. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman began to pray quietly. Others joined in. The old familiar words whispered into the night. Lin listened, but did not pray. She did not know what to say. Thank you felt wrong. Please help felt meaningless. So she just lay there, feeling the mattress beneath her, the blanket over her, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. The morning bell rang at 6 o'clock. Ling woke from a deep, dreamless sleep, the first real sleep she had had in months. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. The smell of wool and soap. Then memory flooded back. America, the base, the enemy's prison. The women rose, dressed in the simple work clothes they had been issued, dark green cotton shirts and pants, practical and clean. They filed to the wash house. There were sinks with running water, real faucets, not a well or a river. Ling turned on a tap and watched the water gush out, clean and clear. She had been taught that waste was a crime against the people. This felt like a crime. Toothbrushes had been provided. The simple, normal act of brushing her teeth, of washing her face with clean water, of combing her hair, all of it felt surreal. Breakfast was at 6:30. Scrambled eggs, toast with jam, orange juice, coffee. Again, more food than Ling had seen in months. She ate slowly, trying to make sense of this abundance, trying not to think about the empty tables and thin rice gruel back in her village. After breakfast, work assignments were announced. The women were divided into groups. Some would work in the kitchen, some in the laundry, some would do general maintenance around the camp. Others would work in the fields just outside the fence, tending vegetable gardens that fed both prisoners and guards. Ling was assigned to the laundry. She spent her days washing and pressing uniforms, sheets, towels. The work was hot and repetitive, but it was not cruel. The American supervisor, a woman named Sergeant Patterson, spoke no Vietnamese, but communicated through gestures and a few basic words. She was neither warm nor cold, just professional. The routine settled into a pattern within days. Wake, wash, eat, work, eat, work, eat, sleep. It was monotonous, but it was predictable, and in predictability, there was a strange comfort. For years, life had been chaos, uncertainty, fear of bombs and starvation and death. Here, for the first time in so long, tomorrow would be the same as today. What stunned the women most was that they were paid, not much, just small wages in camp currency, but they could use it to buy things at the canteen. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, pencils, and paper, small bars of soap that they could keep for themselves. The idea that prisoners would be paid for their work was incomprehensible. Lynn bought a small notebook and a pencil. That evening, sitting on her bunk, she began to write. Not a letter, there was no one to send letters to, but a record. She needed to document this, needed to remember. Someday, she thought, someone will ask what happened here, and I want to remember the truth. She wrote September 28, 1968. I have been here 4 days. I am clean, I am fed, I am warm. I do not understand the enemy. They do not act like enemies. This frightens me more than cruelty would. Letters began to arrive from home in October, delivered by the Red Cross. The mail was censored, read by American staff before being delivered. But it was delivered. Lynn received her first letter 6 weeks after arrival. It was from her cousin, who was still with the unit near Way. The words were carefully chosen, knowing that censors would read them. But the message was clear. Things were very bad. There was no food. The American bombing had destroyed the new harvest. The winter was coming, and there was no fuel. People were living in tunnels because the villages above were destroyed. Children were dying. The old were dying. Everyone was dying. Lynn read the letter sitting on her bunk after dinner. Around her, other women were reading their own letters, and the mood in the barrack was heavy, oppressive. One woman was crying silently. Another sat stone-faced, the letter clutched in her hands. The contrast between here and there was becoming unbearable. That night, Lynn could not eat her dinner. She looked at the plate of food, chicken and rice and carrots, and felt sick. How could she eat when her people were starving? How could she accept this comfort when those she loved were suffering? But she ate anyway, because her body demanded it, because refusing food would not feed anyone in Vietnam, because despite everything, she wanted to live. And this realization, this selfish, desperate desire to survive, filled her with shame. The women began to gain weight. After months of starvation, the regular meals were transforming them physically. Faces filled out, hair grew thick and shiny, skin cleared. They looked healthier, stronger, more alive than they had in years. And this physical transformation was its own kind of torture. To grow fat while your family starved was a special kind of hell. Lynn wrote in her notebook, "The food here is good, too good. I am ashamed of every bite, but I cannot stop eating. I hate myself for this weakness. I hate the Americans for their abundance. I hate my country for its collapse. I hate everything." Despite the emotional turmoil, small moments of unexpected humanity began to pierce through the numbness. They were not grand gestures. They were tiny, almost insignificant interactions that somehow meant everything. In the laundry one afternoon, Sergeant Patterson noticed that Lynn's hands were chapped and raw from the hot water and harsh soap. Without a word, she went to her office and returned with a small jar of hand cream. She handed it to Lynn, gestured at her hands, and said, "For you." Lynn stared at the jar. It was such a small thing, but in that moment, it felt like
everything. Someone had noticed her pain. Someone had cared enough to help. The enemy had shown her a kindness that her own cadres never had. She took the jar, her eyes burning with tears, and whispered, "Come on." "Thank you." Sergeant Patterson nodded and walked away. Another time, a young American guard, barely 20 years old, was making his rounds at night when he heard Tom, the older nurse, crying quietly in her bunk. He stopped, awkward, uncertain. Then he pulled a Hershey's chocolate bar from his pocket and set it on the edge of her bunk. "I'm sorry," he said in broken, halting Vietnamese, "for your sadness." And he walked away before she could respond. These small gestures did not erase the larger realities. They did not stop the B-52s from flying. They did not rebuild the destroyed villages or bring back the dead. But they complicated things. They made it harder to hate. They made it impossible to see the Americans as simply the enemy. They were people. Complicated, contradictory human people. Some of the women tried to maintain their resistance, their loyalty to the fallen cause. They refused to smile at guards. They worked slowly, resentfully. They whispered among themselves that all of this kindness was a lie, a trick, a trap. A woman named Mai, who had been a political officer, insisted. "They want to break us," she hissed one night in the dark. "They want us to forget who we are. This is psychological warfare. This is re-education. We must resist." But their arguments grew weaker with each passing week because the trap never sprang. The lie never revealed itself. The kindness just continued. Lynn found herself learning English words, simple words at first. "Thank you. Good morning. Water, please." The Americans seemed pleased when she tried. They spoke slowly, helped her with pronunciation. It felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught, but it also felt necessary, like survival. By November, 3 months into captivity, Lynn was caught in a war that had nothing to do with guns or jungles. This war was inside her, between who she had been and who she was becoming. Every day the conflict grew sharper, more painful, more impossible to ignore. She had been raised to believe certain things, that Vietnam was righteous, that the struggle was noble, that the Americans were subhuman devils, and that suffering was the highest virtue. These beliefs had shaped her entire young life. They had sent her to operate a radio for the revolution. They had convinced her that she was serving something larger, something important. But here, in this American prison camp, every one of those beliefs was being challenged, not with arguments, not with propaganda, but with reality. The Americans were not subhuman, they were just people, often kind people. The superiority she had been promised had left her starving in the jungle while the enemy lived in abundance. The sacrifice had been for what? Lynn wrote in her notebook, "I do not know who I am anymore. The girl who believed is dead. But what replaces her? If everything I was taught was lies, then what is true? And if I accept these new truths, what does that make me? A traitor? A survivor? Or just someone too weak to hold on to what she believed?" The guilt was crushing. Guilt for eating while others starved. Guilt for feeling grateful for her clean bed. Guilt for learning English. Guilt for not hating the Americans more. Guilt for surviving when so many had not. The weight of it made her feel like she was drowning. Some nights she lay awake thinking about her brother Hai. He had believed so deeply, even as he starved, even in those final terrible days, he had believed that the revolution would save them, that victory would come, and that their suffering meant something. He had died believing that lie. And Lynn, alive and fed in an enemy camp, knew it had all been a lie. Was it better to die believing, or to live knowing the truth? She did not know. She had no answer. The barracks at night became a place of whispered debates. Not loud arguments, those would attract attention, but intense, quiet conversations about what everything meant.
The women were all struggling with the same questions, all feeling the same contradictions tear at them. Some tried to cling to the old beliefs. Mai, the former political officer, was the most rigid. "This is a trick," she hissed, her voice a sharp whisper from the opposite bunk. "They want to break us. They want us to forget who we are. This is psychological warfare, more potent than their bombs. We must resist." But others, like Tam, the older nurse, were beginning to accept a harder truth. She had seen things in the field, seen the way their own officers sometimes treated the villagers. "We were wrong," she said quietly one night, her voice heavy. "About what? About everything?" another woman challenged. Tam just shook her head. "About ourselves. About what we were fighting for." The younger women were perhaps the most conflicted. They had known nothing but the revolution, nothing but the party's education. To reject it now was to reject their entire foundation. Lynn found herself somewhere in the middle. She could no longer believe the old lies, but accepting the new reality felt like betrayal. So she existed in a painful limbo, listening to the whispers, writing in her notebook, afraid to move forward. One evening in late November, a woman named Anna, a 17-year-old medic's aide, said something that silenced the entire barrack. "If what we were told about the Americans was lies," she said slowly, her voice trembling, "then what else were we lied to about?" The question hung in the air, heavy and toxic. "The trains," someone whispered. "The camps. The people who disappeared." No one answered, because they all knew the answer. They had all heard whispers, seen things, been told not to ask questions. And now, sitting in an American camp where they were treated with unexpected humanity, the terrible possibility emerged that everything they had been told was inverted, that the real monsters had been on their own side. In December, the American camp administrator arranged for the women to watch a film. They were herded into a large room with a movie screen. They were going to see something important, they were told. Most of the women expected propaganda, American justifications for their victory, films of their president or their gleaming, decadent cities. What they saw instead was footage from Hue, their Hue. From February 1968, just after the city had been retaken by the Americans. The film was black and white, grainy newsreel footage. But it was clear, undeniable. It showed the liberation of the city, but not as a victory. It showed the discovery of the mass graves, piles of bodies pulled from shallow pits, civilians, teachers, merchants, priests, monks, women, children, all with their hands tied behind their backs. Some women in the barracks closed their eyes. Some vomited. Some wept. Mai, the political officer, stood up and shouted, "Lies! This is fabrication! American propaganda!" But her voice shook. Ling watched, forcing herself to look. She felt something inside her shatter completely. She had known on some level. Everyone had known something. During the offensive, she had heard the reports, the whispers of purifying the city, of traitors to the revolution being dealt with. But knowing and seeing were different things. And seeing made it real in a way that could never be unknown. After the film, no one spoke. They filed back to their barracks in silence. That night, the whispered conversations did not happen. There was nothing to say. The truth was too large, too terrible, too final. Ling lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling. She thought about the soap she had been given, the hot showers, the food, the blankets, the hand cream. The Americans had shown her dignity, even though she had served the regime that committed those atrocities in Hue. They had treated her as human, even though her side had treated others as subhuman. The contradiction was staggering. The power of it took her breath away. The Americans could have been cruel. They had every right to be cruel. They had uncovered those graves. They had seen what had been done. And yet, they chose mercy. Not because the Vietnamese women deserved it, but because mercy was who they chose to be. That realization broke something in Ling, broke it and rebuilt it. She understood now why the kindness had been so painful. It was because kindness demanded recognition of shared humanity. Cruelty allowed for distance, for otherness. But kindness said, "You are human, I am human, we are the same." And if they were the same, then the differences she had been taught to kill for were lies. She wrote in her notebook that night, her hand shaking. "The enemy has defeated me," she wrote, the small pencil lead threatening to snap. Not with violence, but with soap and bread and mercy. "They have shown me what my own people never did. They have treated me with the dignity that my leaders denied to others. And I will carry this shame forever. But I will also carry this truth, that the measure of a people is not in their strength, but in their mercy. And by that measure, we failed. Utterly and completely, we failed." Tet, the Lunar New Year, came to the camp in late January 1969. It was the most sacred time of year, a time for family, for ancestors, for hope. The women expected nothing. To them, it was a day of profound sadness, a marker of another year spent in captivity, another year their families were suffering. But the Americans did something. The camp administrators, perhaps sensing the deep melancholy, arranged for a special meal. It wasn't traditional, of course. It was just more food and small cakes and extra fruit. They decorated the mess hall with awkward, handmade red banners that missed the cultural nuance but shouted the intention. The generosity was almost cruel in its kindness. On New Year's morning, each woman was given a small package. Inside was not a weapon or propaganda. It was a new bar of soap, a small, sealed bag of peanuts and dried fruit, and a blank notebook with a new pencil. Lynn held the package in her hands and felt something break inside her completely. They had remembered. The enemy had remembered their most important holiday and had given them gifts. Gifts of cleanliness, of sustenance, and of thought. The absurdity of it, the impossible kindness of it, was overwhelming. That afternoon, Lynn walked alone to the fence at the far edge of the camp. The air was cool and damp. She stood there looking out at the American base, a sprawling city of machines and men, thinking about everything that had brought her to this moment. She thought about who she had been a year ago. A girl who believed, who operated her radio without question, who thought she was serving something noble. That girl was gone. Killed not by bullets or bombs, but by kindness and truth. Who was she now? A traitor who had accepted enemy mercy? A survivor who chose life over loyalty? A woman who finally saw the truth? She did not know. Maybe she was all of those things. Tem, the older nurse, came to stand beside her. They stood in silence for a long time. Two women who had lost everything and found something they never expected. Finally, Tam spoke, her voice quiet. "I will never forget this," she said, "what they did to us here." "The imprisonment?" Lynn said bitterly. "No," Tam replied, shaking her head. "Not the imprisonment. That was expected. The mercy, the simple, human mercy. I will carry it with me forever." Lynn nodded, the tears she had held back finally blurring the barbed wire in front of her. The irony was unbearable. They had survived the war. They had survived the collapse of their jungle outpost. They had survived captivity. But they might not survive this kindness. Because kindness demanded change. It demanded growth. It demanded that they become something new.
And that transformation was more painful than any physical suffering could ever be. That night, Lynn made a decision. She would stop fighting, stop resisting, stop trying to cling to who she had been. That person was gone. And maybe that was okay. Maybe it was necessary. Maybe she needed to die so that someone new could be born. Someone who understood that the world was more complicated than she had ever imagined. Someone who knew that mercy was more powerful than hatred. She wrote in her notebook, the new notebook, with the new pencil. Today I let go. Not of my past, not of my people, not of my losses. Those are part of me forever. But I let go of the lies, of the hatred, of the belief that we were superior and they were less. I let go because holding on was killing me. And I choose to live. Even if living means shame, even if it means acknowledging that I was wrong, I choose to live, and to learn, and to remember. And maybe that is enough.
In February 1969, as the Paris peace talks sputtered, the announcement came. As a gesture of goodwill, some female prisoners would be repatriated. The women would be sent home, back to Vietnam, back to the ruins. The news was met with mixed reactions. Some women wept with relief. Home. Finally home. But others, like Lynn, felt only dread. What home? What was waiting for them there? And how could they return, healthy and fed, to people who were starving? How could they explain what had happened to them? That the enemy had shown them more mercy than their own leaders? Lynn's fear was not of the journey. It was of what came after. How do you go back to a place that no longer exists? How do you explain to people who are suffering that you survived, not just survived, but lived better as a prisoner than they did as free people? The shame of it was overwhelming. They left the camp in late April. The same trucks that had brought them now carried them away. The women, wearing new clothes provided by the Americans, carrying small bags of possessions, looked healthier than they had in years. Their faces were full, their hair was clean and shiny. They looked like they had been cared for, because they had been. The journey back across the Pacific was a blur. They landed in Da Nang in May. The city was a sprawling, chaotic American fortress. But as they were driven out, back towards the countryside near Hue, the world changed. Where buildings had stood were piles of rubble. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. People moved like ghosts through the ruins, thin and gray and broken. Lynn stood on the roadside at the repatriation point, looking at what remained of her country, and felt the full weight of what she carried. She was healthy. She was alive. She had been cared for while her people had suffered. The guilt was crushing. She made her way through the ruins, asking after people she had known. Most were dead. Some had fled. Finally, she found her cousin, the one who had written to her. He was living in the cellar of a destroyed building. He was thin, his eyes hollow, one arm missing at the elbow. He looked at Lynn, at her healthy face and clean clothes, and something flickered in his eyes. Not quite judgment, not quite resentment, but something. "You were in America?" he asked, his voice a rasp. "Yes," Lynn said. "I was a prisoner." The man nodded slowly. "You look well," he said. And Lynn heard everything that was not said. "You look well while we starved. You were fed while we died." Years passed. The war ended. Vietnam rebuilt, slowly, painfully. Lynn found work, married a man who had also lost everything, and had children. She built a new life, but she never forgot the camp, never forgot the kindness that had broken her more completely than cruelty ever could. She kept her notebook hidden in a drawer, and sometimes late at night, she would take it out and read what she had written. When her daughter was 16, she asked Lynn about the war. What was it like? What did you do? Lynn had avoided these questions for years, but looking at her daughter's face, seeing the genuine curiosity, she decided it was time. They sat at the kitchen table, and Lynn told her about the radio post, the surrender, the helicopter, the fear. And then, carefully, she told her about the camp, about the soap, about the hot showers, the food about Hue, and the small kindnesses that had undone her completely. Her daughter listened in silence. When Lynn finished, the girl asked, "Were they good to you because they were good people, or because it was a trick?" Lynn thought about this for a long time. Then she said, "I do not know. Maybe both. Maybe it does not matter. What matters is that they could have been cruel, and they chose not to be. They had every reason to hate us, and they chose mercy instead." "Why does that matter?" her daughter asked. "Because," she said slowly, "it means that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose kindness. It means that mercy is not weakness. It is strength. And it means that maybe, just maybe, we can learn to be better than we were." She pulled out her notebook and showed her daughter the final entry, written in 1969. "I will never forget the soap," it read. The simple white bar. It was just soap, but it was also proof. Proof that the world is not what we were taught. Proof that enemies can be human. Proof that mercy exists even in the darkest places. And proof that sometimes the hardest thing to accept is not cruelty, but kindness. Because kindness demands that we change, and change is the most painful thing of all. For those 32 women who passed through that camp, the experience of unexpected mercy became a defining moment. They had been told to close their eyes, to expect horrors, to prepare for the worst. What came next shocked them more deeply than cruelty ever could, because what came next was simple humanity. Hot showers, clean clothes, regular meals. These simple, basic human dignities dismantled their worldview more effectively than any propaganda could have. The story of these women is not a happy story. Many struggled for years with the contradictions, but it is a story about the power of choosing mercy over vengeance. The Americans who ran that camp could have been cruel. They had every justification. They had seen the graves at Hue. But they chose to treat their prisoners as human beings, and that choice mattered. If this story moved you, if these forgotten chapters of history matter to you, please subscribe to this channel. These stories deserve to be told. These lessons deserve to be learned. Thank you for watching and for remembering.